Political philosopher, lecturer at Charles University in Prague, and director of the Free Russia Institute, Alexander Morozov, stated that there are currently signs of rather acute elite conflicts in Russia. They are the result of Putin not knowing the answer to the fork in the road he's at and not making it clear what he intends to do, he emphasized in an interview with Glavred. The expert notes that there is no visible popular protest, but an elite conflict surrounding the blockades is evident. It was very obvious. Natalya Kaspersky, who for many years was the leader of the entire FSB-Industrial Group, which ensures cybersecurity, is publicly speaking out against the FSB's second service. This has simply never happened before. It was impossible to imagine that anyone would publicly engage in such a conflict, he noted. The interviewee notes that today in the Russian Federation there are 3 large corporations between which conflicts occur. Everyone knows this well and has discussed it many times. The first is the epaulets, meaning the various security forces. The second is the horde of civilian administrators. The third is what used to be called oligarchs, but is no longer called that, but we are talking about the business environment. All 3 groups have resources. That is why they are now in acute conflict. Putin used to blend such conflicts. He truly occupied the position of a so-called guarantor, someone who stands above the fray and reconciles interests. But the war has changed the situation, because a new reality has emerged within the elites. Now these elites find themselves in a situation where each of the large groups must answer the question, what will happen to them after the end of the active phase of the war? This is a difficult question. Both understand that over 4 years of war, they have adapted to an emergency situation, he recalled. The analyst added that sooner or later, the question of who is responsible for the consequences of the failed war will arise in Russia. This is the complexity of the structure. We're all right when we say Putin will never end the war. Why won't he? Because he'll have to answer for why it ended so unsuccessfully. For such a large country, with such great pretensions, if we constantly claim, we are the greatest in the world, everyone respects us, everyone fears us, there are only 3 countries on the planet, the USA, China, and Russia, as Kremlin political scientists constantly write, then we'll have to answer to the entire ruling and active class, civilian administrators, security officials, and entrepreneurs, Morozov concluded. Georgy Tuka commented on the likelihood of internal resistance in Russia. He believes that a certain segment of the Russian elite could theoretically be dissatisfied with the situation and consider protests. At the same time, Tuka emphasized that in recent years, the Russian authorities, led by Vladimir Putin, have consistently suppressed any manifestation of opposition activity. This has been particularly active, he said, over the past 2 years. As a result, the expert believes, there are virtually no influential forces in the country capable of openly opposing the current government. According to the expert, a similar situation developed in the Soviet Union when it began to collapse, when there was no money to support local elites, and no money was coming from Moscow. Of course, there are still Russian deposits, another 60 trillion rubles. And the Russian government will still try to confiscate these deposits. It's already implementing mechanisms that prevent the population from withdrawing money from banks. This is being done with vague wording. If a bank sees transactions that it deems uncontrolled, it has the right to freeze the money. This phenomenon has become widespread, he explained. Zagorodny also recalled that before the collapse of the USSR, a confiscatory monetary reform was carried out. Russia is still afraid to do this, but these processes are also underway. And as early as the first quarter of 2026, we will see big surprises in Russia that are already being prepared, he added. Signs of a power crisis are intensifying in Russia, elite rhetoric is shifting, economic pressure is growing, and unity around the war is eroding. Recently, this is stated in an analysis by The Economist. Western analysts believe that Vladimir Putin has ultimately driven Russia into a strategic and political deadlock. A key signal of the crisis is not only economic or political stagnation, but also a change in the language used by Russian elites regarding the war and whereas previously Russian business leaders and officials spoke of the war as a shared project, they are now increasingly distancing themselves from it. The formula we, which symbolized elite unity around Kremlin decisions, is disappearing. Instead, Putin's decisions are more frequently described as strange, and he is increasingly perceived as a separate political center, detached from the country's future. According to The Economist, the crisis in Russia has several key dimensions: the cost of war. The consequences of the conflict are becoming increasingly tangible for the population: inflation, rising taxes, and strain on infrastructure, while the strategic goals of the war remain unclear. Lack of rules. A large-scale redistribution of property is underway, accompanied by asset seizures. Business elites seek stability but face the dominance of the rule of force. Geopolitical weakening. Russia has lost part of its international influence, particularly in the energy sector, and its position in global institutions has weakened. Identity crisis. The absence of a clear internal development model after losing the traditional confrontation with the West. Analysts note that the old social contract, comfort in exchange for political passivity, no longer works. Instead, citizens and elites are expected to show loyalty without guarantees of stability or development. According to experts, the Kremlin's ideological model does not offer a clear scenario for ending the conflict or achieving victory, creating a state of prolonged instability. In conclusion, the situation is compared to a zugzwang. Any further moves by the Russian leadership, from increasing repression to launching new military actions, only deepen the systemic crisis. The New York Times recently quoted Claudia Major of the German Marshall Fund arguing that the Europeans lack a theory of victory for Ukraine. The previous idea, she suggested, was to put enough pressure on Russia to change its calculus, but we never gave the Ukrainians enough to do that. Now we just try to keep the Ukrainians in the game until something in Moscow changes, someone dies or is thrown out the window or the economy collapses. But it's not a strategy. If the Ukrainians were unable to do so, it would be calamitous. As the Allies were never going to fight side by side with the Ukrainians, it was never likely that they could put enough pressure on Moscow to get it to abandon its war aims. Once Putin decided in September 2022 that he was prepared to fight a long war, the Ukrainians had to make the same determination. All they could do was to hope that over time they would be able to change perceptions inside the Kremlin about whether the war was being won or was even winnable. The fact that this has yet to happen does not mean that the strategy was wrong. Only that it required patience. The literature on strategy encourages the expectation that it is all about providing a route to a winning position. But many strategies are about efforts to retrieve a losing position, for example after being invaded. In the first instance, avoiding defeat can be a demanding enough objective. Keeping the Ukrainians in the game confirms the failure of Russian strategy. Putin has also had to discover patience as an operation he expected to be over in a matter of days has dragged on for years. When one considers the resources Russia has committed, the fact that it is no closer to victory now than it was in 2022 is quite staggering. Continuing to deny Russia a victory is therefore a necessary condition for future Ukrainian success, but of course it cannot be sufficient. There is no simple way to persuade the Kremlin to change course when Ukraine cannot yet deploy overwhelming military power. There are other factors that might shape Putin's view of the war and his expectations of success, some of which the Ukrainians and their partners might be able to influence, but many of which they cannot. This is why there is an unavoidable element of wait and see in Ukrainian strategy.